Why does God allow cruelty and suffering in the world?
There are dozens and dozens of really good logical arguments for God's existence that are not only technically valid, but I believe are truly sound. But there is this persistent argument against God's existence, the problem of evil. And this has been around for literally thousands of years. The implications of how you answer this question not only shape how you think about God, but how you relate to the suffering and difficulties of your life. It even shapes the way you think about the way the state interacts with the people. Let's go ahead and let's jump right into it.
There's two types of cruelty and suffering. So if we're talking about human cruelty and suffering, because God does not intervene to prevent people from exercising their free will, because to do so would be to deprive human beings of the choice that makes them human. And this is the sin of the Garden of Eden, basically, is that God could make you an angel, in which case you wouldn't have the choice to do the wrong thing. But so long as we are going to allow for cause and effect in a universe shaped by your choice, cruelty and evil are going.
He did a very good job of dividing evil up into two different parts. He's about to get to the second, which is natural suffering, things like cancer, tornadoes, earthquakes. But the first is really the most common one, which is why does God allow humans to do evil things to one another? And he presents the free will defense, which I think is exactly right. I think C.S. Lewis did a phenomenal job of articulating why it is that once you have free will, you inevitably have suffering. He says, imagine a world in which you just have two creatures created by God that have independent wills and desires and intellects. Now, there's some medium for them to interact, like the three-dimensional world. In the instant those three things exist, then there's almost the inevitability of sufferings. We should think of suffering as the world being in a way that we don't want it to be, right? It's not simply physical pain, though that's one of the ways we don't want the world to be. But breaking my toe is far less suffering than the loss of a loved one. As soon as person one has an independent will of person two and he wants the world to be a certain way that person two doesn't desire, now we have the conditions for suffering. In fact, person two is now suffering. Or they compromise and they're both suffering by definition. Now, there are ways to resolve this, but none of them preserve the freedom of the individual. So God could come in and he could, change all of our wills in such a way that none of them ever contradict. But now we're no longer free. We're no longer actual persons. We're puppets. We're robots. We're like action figures that a kid would play with. Or he could, say, give us something like a collective hive mind where we all have a unified desire and unified intellect. But then again, there's only one entity that would essentially exist other than God. So long as God desires a world in which there are multiple independent people that actually exist autonomously from one another, that have the capacity for moral choice and will, then there is always going to be inevitably some form of suffering. So that's the problem of evil. What about natural suffering?
Exist. And then there's the question of just the natural cruelty and vicissitudes of life. And the answer there is I think that God obscures himself. I think that if God were to appear in all of his glory to people on a regular basis, I think that it would make faith, and you wouldn't need it. There'd be no such thing as faith, right? It would just be reality, right? Nobody has to prove to you that the sun rises every day. If God is to allow us the choice to believe in him, which is the ultimate choice from a religious point of view, then he's going to have to obscure himself behind tragedy and horror and all those other things. I mean, this is a fairly well-known Kabbalistic concept called Tzimtzum in Judaism, which is the idea that when God created the universe, he sort of withdrew in order to make space for all of these things to happen.
I really like Ben Shapiro. I have a general rule against punching right, but I really dislike this answer. I don't think that the problem of evil, certainly, he says this is a deeply rooted Jewish idea. It's not rooted in the scriptures. The Bible, in no sense, teaches this idea that God intentionally creates a world full of catastrophe in order to hide his presence so that you can then have the capacity to have faith. Rather, the Bible is very clear that he has proven his existence in creation and in conscience. Rather, that the existence of the universe from nothing proves his existence. Robert Jastrow wrote a book called God and the Astronomers about how the Big Bang Theory essentially proves that the theologians were correct. It ends with some sort of wonderful line about the scientists climbing up the mountain of knowledge only to barely summit it to notice that the theologians have been sitting there for centuries. The fine tuning obviously proves that God exists, that the universe exhibits the markings of design all the way down to its mathematical level. The ardent atheist Fred Hoyle turned into a deist who couldn't even bring himself to call God God. He just called him a super intellect. But he said that the numbers one calculates when looking at the fine tuning put the existence of this super intellect beyond question. It was so obvious to him that God had what he said monkeyed with nature's numbers to result in our existence. The fact that we're moral creatures, even though we're made of flesh and matter, that we grasp this immaterial world called the moral realm, and that we understand that we're obligated to obey it in some sense, clearly indicates what the Bible says in Romans 2, that God has written his law on all of our hearts. Rather, people don't believe in God because they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, not because it's not clear. So then why is there natural suffering? Well, first, these are the immediate implications and logical implications of a universe governed by natural law. As soon as you have something like the second law of thermodynamics that would disperse the heat inside of a bathtub so that there isn't like all the heat in one single spot that would utterly scald you and then the rest of it would be ice cold, but rather it disperses the heat, evenly throughout the water. That very same law will result in your body wearing out over time. So these are the logical implications simply of an orderly universe. But God could obviously work miracles constantly, every second of every day, in order to make sure that those consequences are never felt by his creatures. So then why doesn't he perform those miracles constantly? Again, because he has good reason to allow them. We can all attest to the difficulties and the trials of life having produced in us the character that we needed for other events in our lives. And this is a very common insight to most philosophy. I'm very sympathetic to Stoicism. I consider myself a bit of a Christian Stoic. Seneca says that it is impossible to polish a jewel without friction. And similarly, you cannot perfect a man without his difficulties. James says that we should consider all of our trials joy because of what they produce in us. Paul says that all of the suffering he underwent, which was both the natural suffering and the evil of men, produced in him the eternal weight of glory. So this answers why it is that God allows these things. The good that is accomplished by this suffering is so good that it justifies the immediate suffering that we go through. Now, how does that have implications first on ourselves? And then we'll talk about the policy implications. First is, how do we personally deal with these types of situations? Number one, we do it with God. We do it knowing that in his providence, he's allowing it and realizing that he has some sort of grand reason for it. He works all things for the good of those who love him. So we love him and say, God, thank you that even for the miseries, because I know that you are only allowing it for some great grand purpose. Next, we this famous Stoic quote to premeditatio malorum, to premeditate on the suffering you're going to encounter and realize again ahead of time that it's going to be for good, and that we should be in some sense prepared both emotionally and physically for it. This gives us great reason to be disciplined. Why should you work out? Why should you do your mobility drills? Why should you build up a savings? Why should you pay for insurance? Because you know that suffering is inevitable and it is causing you now to become a more disciplined, responsible individual. Now, what about the policy implications? Well, if you realize that man is of the nature to suffer and then to be sanctified by that suffering, then the idea that we need to create an overarching government with the capacity to give us everything that we want and prevent all forms of suffering is simply to ask the government to step in and be God. But remember, there's only a certain range of possibilities. And so if God were to step in and prevent certain forms of suffering, that also means preventing certain forms of good. If he forces us all to desire the same thing while remaining individuals, then we're essentially just robots. This is quite literally what Karl Marx was about. He saw socialism as the intermediate state in which you essentially change human nature so that man would then embrace communism. Marcuse, I can never say his name right. He says that we have to essentially force man down to his DNA to become a communist because it's not in man's nature. So this far left view of politics is that the state essentially changes you. It changes your will and your desire and your intellect to be what they want it to be, and that's how you avoid all the suffering in the world. God wants individuals with individual desires to act virtuously in order to create righteous community. Leftists want to conscientize us into collectivists with the result of totally undifferentiated outcomes. That's it for today. My name is Ryan Martin, and this is Unsafe Media. If you're the kind of person who has not joined my Patreon yet, you're probably also the kind of person who thinks that neo-Marxism is actually a conspiracy theory and not a legitimate movement of leftist politics in the 1960s and 70s. Join the Patreon. Like, share, subscribe, comment down below all the things that you think I'm wrong about. And until next time, trust God and keep your powder dry.